She collapsed on a train platform in the middle of nowhere, bruised, silent, and nearly broken. But what if I told you that moment wasn't the end of her story? It was just the beginning. A beginning filled with second chances, fierce love, and the kind of strength most people don't even know they have. Stick around, because by the end of this story, you won't just believe in redemption, you'll feel it in your bones. The train to Lone Pine Station arrived late that afternoon, dragging behind it a howl of wind and a trail of dust that curled like smoke across the Colorado plains. The station sat quiet, bathed in brittle spring sunlight that made no promises of warmth. Snow still clung to the northern slopes of the surrounding hills, reluctant to let go. When the steam engine hissed and the brake wheels groaned, it broke the stillness like a thunderclap. Out stepped a woman who seemed more ghost than passenger. She stumbled as soon as her foot touched the platform. No one caught her. No one moved. The other passengers filtered off the train like water around a stone, not seeing her or choosing not to. She stood for a second, swaying in place, and then fell forward. No hands reached out. Her body hit the planks hard. The sound echoed a dull, desperate thud against old wood. The station master, a man used to handling crates and cattle, manifests more than broken people froze in place. He'd seen accidents. He'd seen pain. But nothing prepared him for this. She didn't cry out. That silence chilled him more than the wind ever could. Her dress, once fine, now hung in tatters. Mud clung to the hem, dried like old blood. Her boots were scuffed nearly to the bone, the leather cracked and waterlogged. Her lip was split, healing poorly. One eye was nearly shut with bruising. But it was the way her fingers trembled even as she lay on the ground that made the station master step back, a faint gasp caught in his throat. He called out "Miss," but there was no response. Her hands kept shaking. That was when Boone Whitaker moved. A tall, broad-shouldered cowboy with sand-colored hair and eyes the color of storm clouds, he had been waiting at the freight end of the platform, arms crossed, hat low. He hadn't spoken much since arriving that morning, hadn't spoken at all since the train pulled in. But the moment the woman collapsed, he was already moving. 3 strides brought him to her side. He didn't ask questions. He knelt down, slid one arm under her shoulders and another under her knees, and lifted her with a gentleness that didn't match the grit under his boots. Her head lolled against his chest, her breath short and shallow. Boone looked down at her face and frowned, not in judgment, something else. Something almost like recognition. Or maybe memory. "She needs a doctor," he said, turning to the station master. "Closest is 5 miles off in Ember Ridge," the man replied, fumbling with his hat. "You can take the South Trail quicker that way." Boone didn't wait for more. He didn't ask for help. He simply turned still, carrying the woman, and walked toward his mare, a buckskin, with a patient eye and a steady gait. He mounted, settled the woman across the saddle in front of him, and rode off without a backward glance. The wind picked up as they rode. It pressed at his coat, pulled at her torn dress. Boone held her securely, one arm around her waist, the other managing the reins. The trail was uneven in places, thawing from the freeze, but the mare found her path. About halfway there, the woman stirred, not fully conscious, but something close. She flinched when his arm shifted. Boone slowed the horse. "You're all right," he said low and steady. "Ain't nobody gonna hurt you now." Her breath caught, then evened out again. She didn't speak. By the time Ember Ridge came into view, the sun had slipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the valley floor. The town was small, a scattering of buildings gathered like neighbors close against the cold. Boone rode straight to the edge of town to a whitewashed house with a crooked sign above the door. Dr. A. Morley, General Care. He dismounted, lifting the woman into his arms once again, and knocked with the side of his boot. The door swung open, revealing a woman in her 60s sleeves-rolled apron dusted with herbs. Dr. Agnes Morley had seen plenty in her years, births, burns, bullets, but even she paused at the sight before her. She collapsed, Boone nodded. "Train platform, bring her in." He laid her on the cot as directed. "Doctor," Morley began her work at once, cutting away ruined fabric cleaning wounds, inspecting bruises with practiced hands. Boone stood back, jaw-clenched eyes never leaving the woman's face. "She'll live," Morley said finally, her voice gentler now, "but she's starving, exhausted. That eye'll need time." What happened? Boone shook his head. She didn't say, didn't speak at all. "Well," Morley said, wrapping a bandage with quick fingers, "some stories take time to be told. You stickin' around. Reckon I will." She raised a brow, but said nothing more. Boone took the chair near the window. The oil lamp flickered, casting soft light across the room. Outside, the wind scraped against the eaves. Inside, the woman lay still, save for the slow rise and fall of her chest. Boone leaned back, the creak of wood under his weight the only sound for a long time. He didn't know her name, didn't know where she came from, or what ghosts rode her heels, but he'd seen the way she fell, and something in him, a place he thought long gone quiet, would not let him walk away. The next morning broke with the hush of a town still tangled in sleep. Ember Ridge, nestled among hills slow to warm, in spring wore its usual dawn colors, dusty gray and streaks of rose. Inside Dr. Morley's clinic, a single oil lamp glowed against the pale wash of morning light. Eleanor Hart opened her eyes. The ceiling above her was wooden, marked with years of knots and nail heads, but it was still. No angry footsteps overhead. No heavy fists against doors. Just the creak of old timbers settling and the faint rustle of leaves brushing the glass. She breathed in, slowly, unsure if she was still dreaming. Her ribs ached. Her lips were chapped. Her wrist itched under bandages. There was a man sitting in the corner. At first she startled. Her breath caught and her body tensed. But he didn't move, just sat there, big man in worn denim and dusty boots, holding a metal mug in both hands. His gaze wasn't hard, just steady. "Morning," he said quietly. Ellie swallowed. Her throat was dry as sand. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The silence held, but it wasn't cruel. He didn't fill it, just waited, like he had all the time in the world. "I brought you here," he said after a beat. "You passed out at the station. My name's Boone. Boone Whitaker." She nodded faintly. "You hungry?" She hesitated, then gave the smallest of nods. Boone stood, stepped out into the hallway, and returned with a bowl of warm oatmeal and a tin cup of weak tea. She lifted the spoon slowly, her fingers trembling. Half the oatmeal spilled, but he didn't flinch. Didn't offer to help. Just watched her eat like it was the most important thing in the world. Over the next few days, Ellie barely spoke. She slept, and when she didn't, she sat by the window watching the clouds roll past the hills. Her face began to regain its shape, the swelling in her eye, receding the bruises, shifting from dark purple to yellow-green. Dr. Morley came and went, checking wounds and leaving folded blankets at the end of the bed. But Boone never left. Every morning, he showed up with something: biscuits, a newspaper, a small bunch of wildflowers wrapped in string. He never stayed long unless she wanted him to. Sometimes he'd sit in the chair and talk about nothing. How the snowmelt was making the river rise. How a fox had snuck into his chicken coop. How the town kids were daring each other to knock on the blacksmith's door at night. And sometimes, when the room was quiet and Ellie's hands were still, he'd just sit. It was a stillness she hadn't known in years. She began to speak in short phrases. A yes, a no, a thank you, And then one evening, as dusk painted the clinic walls gold and lavender, she looked at him and said, "I had 2 children." Boone stopped talking. Waited. "Ira," she continued, 7 years old. "Maisie, 5. She took a breath. Her voice trembled, but she kept going. "My husband, ex-husband, I suppose, he took them. Said I wasn't fit to raise them. Said I was unstable. Told the court I had nothing. He had money friends in the city. Paid people to lie." Her eyes filled. "I tried to run with them. He found me. Took them from the train station. Said if I showed my face again, he'd make sure I disappeared." Boone didn't interrupt, didn't look away. "I haven't seen them in almost a year," she whispered. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Did you tell the sheriff?" She shook her head. "They won't listen. Not to someone like me." He nodded slowly. "Maybe they won't. But I will." Ellie blinked. "Why?" He looked at her eyes, dark and clear. "Because I saw the way you collapsed, and I've seen folks hold on longer than they should just waiting for someone to care, and because I've lost people too." Silence settled between them again, but it wasn't empty. Over the next week, Ellie got stronger. She sat outside in the sun, watched the children chase chickens in the alley, even helped Dr. Morley sweep the porch. Boone walked beside her when she went to fetch bread from the bakery. People stared, but he didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he just didn't care. One afternoon, he handed her a worn leather notebook. "Thought you might want to write to them," he said. She looked down at the blank pages. "I don't know what to say. Start with their names." That night, Ellie sat by the oil lamp and wrote Ira and Maisie, "I hope you still remember me." The words spilled like water, hesitant at first, then full of all the things she had held inside, memories of bedtime stories of braiding Maisie's hair, of the way Ira used to run and trip on his own shoelaces. Boone didn't read the letters, but he sharpened the pencil when she needed it. Later that week, she walked with him to the edge of town where the hills began. He showed her the ridge where he ran cattle, the creek where the trout were thick in spring. "It's peaceful here," she said. "Not much noise, that's why I stayed." She looked at him. "You could have left, could have walked away the moment you saw me." "I could have," he said, "but I didn't want to." She didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "I'm thinking of writing the court in Topeka," she said, "asking for the case to be reopened." He didn't hesitate. "Then do it. You think they'll listen?" "They might not, but they sure as hell won't if you stay silent." Ellie nodded. "I'll need help." "You got it." When they returned to the clinic, she pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. She began, "To whom it may concern. My name is Eleanor Hart, and I am seeking to regain custody of my children." Boone read the letter over her shoulder and said quietly, "That's a good start." It was the first time in months she felt like a mother again, and the first time in years she didn't feel alone. The wind shifted that evening just as the sun dipped low behind the ridge. Ember Ridge exhaled the way a town does when its chores are done and its streets begin to quiet. Lanterns flickered to life behind shuttered windows, and the first hints of night swept across porches and dusty storefronts. Ellie stood on the steps outside Dr. Morley's clinic, arms wrapped around herself, staring into the growing dark. She wasn't cold, but the stillness of that dusk felt heavier than usual. Behind her, Boone stepped out carrying 2 mugs. The scent of peppermint and a trace of honey followed him. "Tea," he said simply, handing one to her. She took it without a word. Her hands no longer trembled when they touched the cup, though faint bruises still curled around her wrists like ghosted cuffs. She sipped slowly. The quiet between them had taken on a new kind of shape. Not awkward or uncertain, but something honest and settled. Boone didn't fill it with words. He just stood beside her watching the sky change color. I sent the letter, she said, breaking the silence. He didn't turn. Topeka, she nodded. Used a name he won't recognize. Took me 4 tries to get it all on paper. Boone glanced over. You did good. Ellie looked down at the cup in her hands. You think they'll write back? I think, if they've got half a conscience, they will. She smiled barely. I haven't counted on people's consciences in a long time. Boone didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded map. He held it toward her. What's this county lines, he said, and here he pointed, is where your ex-husband's property sits, if he hasn't sold it off. Ellie unfolded the map on the porch rail, tracing the faint pencil marks with her fingertip. You've been there. Boone nodded. Ran cattle past it 5 years ago. Big white house, double gables. New fence back then. She didn't say anything, just stared at the ink and the memory it stirred. If it comes to it, Boone said, after a while, you'll need to show them you've got a stable place. A home, means of support. Folks who will vouch for your character. Ellie folded the map again. Dr. Morley said she would, Miss Cartwright too. He sipped his tea. That's a start. The lantern hanging from the porch post flickered as a gust of wind brushed by. Ellie leaned against the rail, her eyes distant. I want them to know I didn't leave because I didn't care, she said. I left because I couldn't survive it anymore. Boone's voice was low. They'll know. She turned toward him. What if I go back and it's all for nothing? What if they slam the door in my face? He met her gaze. Then we knock again. Or kick it in. She laughed an unpolished, surprised sound that escaped before she could stop it. Boone smiled too, but softly. You ever think what you'd do if you got them back? Ellie took a deep breath. I think about a house, not big, something with trees, maybe a stream, a place where they can run without looking over their shoulders. Boone nodded slowly. I know a place like that. She raised an eyebrow. It's been sitting quiet since Old Man Reeve passed. Land's good, barn needs fixing. But the porch faces west. Ellie blinked. Why are you telling me this? Because I've been thinking about what comes next, too. She looked away quickly, the motion reflexive. You don't owe me anything, Boone. I'm not offering it because I owe you, he replied. I'm offering it because it's yours if you want it. The porch fell quiet again. That night she wrote another letter. This time it wasn't addressed to any court, it was to Ira and Maisie. Her handwriting had grown steadier. She wrote about the sound of frogs by the creek, about the way the sunlight spilled across her quilt in the morning, about Boone teaching her how to mend fence rails. She folded the letter carefully, tucked it into the bottom of her trunk. In the days that followed, Ellie began working at the schoolhouse. Miss Cartwright introduced her to a room full of children who stared at her like she was something curious and fragile. At first they said little, but Ellie had a way of kneeling to their level of waiting instead of pushing. By the end of her second day, a quiet girl had left a blue ribbon on Ellie's chair. That evening, Ellie and Boone shelled peas outside the livery. She mentioned the ribbon. I used to braid Maisie's hair with ones like that, she said. Boone didn't speak, just handed her another handful of pods. I wrote the court again, she said, cracking one open. They forwarded my petition to the county clerk, said I'd have to appear in person. Boone leaned back on the bench. You think they'll listen to you now? I don't know. But I can't not try. You'll need someone to ride with you. I will. He looked at her hands, no longer bandaged, though the scars still lingered. You sure you want to go back there? No, she said honestly, but I can't leave them in his house. Not anymore, not now that I'm stronger. Boone folded his arms across his chest. Then I'll come. She didn't thank him. She didn't have to. The next morning, Ellie borrowed a legal ledger from the schoolhouse and began copying notes. Terms she didn't fully understand, names she remembered from the hearing. Boone sat beside her, not reading, but not far either. At one point, he slid a rolled-up map toward her. "This is the county line," he said, "and here's the nearest town. We'll need a place to stay overnight." "You already planned this," she said, eyeing him. "I don't like leaving things to chance." She closed the book. "You always that way. I've seen what happens when people aren't." That night, Boone showed her a saddlebag with a second riding skirt, a coat, and new gloves. Her throat tightened. "That's not mine. It is now. Figured you'd want to ride your own horse." She reached out and touched the smooth leather. Didn't speak. "We leave at first light," he said, then turned to tend the mare. She stood in the barn for a long time, one hand resting on the saddle horn, her other pressed over her chest. Out of fear, out of hope, maybe both. And when the stars rose, she wrote one more letter. This one she would take with her. The prairie was still in the early hours of their departure, with dawn barely cracking over the horizon. The land was hushed expectant, as though it knew something was changing. Eleanor Hart sat astride the mare. Boone had loaned her now, hers, he insisted, clutching the reins with fingers both determined and uncertain. She hadn't ridden this far since the day she tried to run with her children. Her stomach twisted, but she didn't look back. Beside her, Boone rode quietly. He didn't speak unless she did. His presence wasn't loud or demanding. It simply was as steady as the rhythm of hoofbeats beneath them. For 3 days, they traveled east, the land flattening into vast golden stretches. They passed only a few travelers along the way, most too tired or wary to greet them with more than a nod. Ellie didn't mind. The quiet gave her room to think, to prepare. On the second night, they made camp beside a shallow ravine. Boone lit a fire low and tucked close to the stone wall. He handed her a tin plate with hard biscuit and jerky, and sat across from her, stretching his legs toward the warmth. Ellie didn't eat it first. She turned the biscuit in her hand. "I thought I'd be more afraid," she said. Boone looked up. "Why aren't you?" She kept her eyes on the flames. "Because I'm not alone this time." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It held something new, respect perhaps, or understanding. He didn't try to soothe her with empty words. He just nodded and leaned back on his hands, staring at the sky where the stars had begun to gather. By the third day, Topeka rose on the horizon like a distant memory. Ellie pulled her coat tighter around her. The city had grown since she left it. More buildings, more noise, more people who might recognize her. Boone reached over and touched the back of her hand, brief but grounding. "We'll go slow," he said. "You lead." The boarding house they found was modest, a 2-story with peeling paint and a crooked porch. The landlady didn't ask questions, gave them 2 cots and a wash basin, pointed them toward the courthouse. Ellie didn't speak much that night. She sat by the window, staring down at the cobbled street. Boone stayed nearby, but gave her space. He could feel the storm building inside her, the tension of what was coming. He didn't try to interrupt it. He just stood with her in the quiet. The next morning, she rose early, pinned her hair tight, dressed in her riding skirt. Boone stood by the door as she fastened the buttons of her coat. "I don't want you in the room," she said. He nodded. "I'll wait outside." "It's not because I don't want you there, I know." "Then why aren't you arguing?" "Because you already decided." She looked at him, then really looked. "I'm scared." "Good," he said gently. "Means it matters." She left without another word, boots echoing down the hallway. Boone waited on the courthouse steps, arms folded. He didn't pace, didn't fidget. Just stood like a sentry watching the passers-by with that same quiet presence that had drawn Ellie in from the start. Inside the courtroom felt colder than she remembered. The judge was a different man than the one who'd ruled against her last time. Younger, less weary. He listened. Ellie spoke clearly. Her voice only shook once. She explained her past not as an excuse but as truth. She described the beatings, the silence that followed, the fear that became routine. She spoke of Ira's questions, Maisie's cries in the night, the day she packed their bags and left without knowing where they'd sleep. She offered the letters from Dr. Morley and Miss Cartwright, a signed affidavit from Boone. The judge read them all. At the end, Ellie stood with her hands clasped tightly in front of her, waiting for something, anything. The judge leaned back. "We will reopen your petition," he said. "But you must prove you have a home, an income, a stable life, someone to vouch for your character in writing and in person." Ellie nodded slowly. Outside, she stepped into the light blinking like it hurt her eyes. Boone was on his feet in an instant. "They're reopening it," she said. "But I have to prove everything." He didn't blink. "Then we'd better start building." "They want an affidavit," she added, "from someone I live with." He looked at her steady as stone. "You'll have it." Her voice wavered. "It'll mean tying your name to mine." In writing, he replied, "I don't care about names." Ellie looked down at the paper in her hand. "They'll send someone to verify it. I've got a month. Then we'd better be home before fall." She repeated the word to herself, soft and tentative. Home. He reached out, not quite touching her, but close. "That place I told you about. It needs someone who knows how to start again." She smiled, not wide, but true. "Maybe someone like me." They didn't speak again until they stood at the edge of the rail yard. The train hissed like it recognized her. The dust stirred as they mounted their horses. Ellie turned to Boone. "I want them to grow up knowing they're safe, that they're loved, and it doesn't come with a price." He met her eyes. "Then let's build them a life where that's all they ever know." She nodded, and this time when they rode west she didn't look back. Not because she was running, but because what mattered was already riding beside her. They returned to Ember Ridge just as the last of the summer heat began to loosen its grip. The sky hung heavy with the scent of rain, and the cottonwoods that lined the ridge had started their slow shift toward gold. Ellie and Boone rode in silence most of the way, not because they had nothing left to say, but because some things didn't need to be spoken. The road home wasn't quiet, it was full of the sounds of dust hoofbeats and the weight of things finally beginning to settle. When they crested the hill overlooking the land Boone had spoken of, Ellie slowed her mare and looked down. The cabin sat nestled in a small bend of the valley tucked between the creek and a line of weathered cottonwoods. Its roof was spotted with rust, the porch slanted just slightly. A broken gate leaned against the fence, and a barn, old but proud, stood beside it like a sentinel that had seen too many winters. It wasn't perfect, but it felt honest. "This it?" she asked. Boone nodded. "It'll need some fixing. Roof leaks, fencing's gone soft." She glanced at him. "Are we buying it or borrowing it?" "It's yours," he said. "Deed's already in your name. Signed it before we left." She blinked, stunned. "Why?" He looked at her eyes, steady. "Because you can't build something real on land that isn't yours." Her fingers tightened around the reins. "That's more than I asked for." "I know," he said, "but it's not more than you deserve." She turned back toward the cabin. A breeze pushed past them, stirring the tall grass, and for the first time in a long while she felt something close to peace settle deep in her chest. The next weeks passed in a kind of rhythm Ellie hadn't known in years. They worked side by side. Boone patched the roof, while Ellie sanded the porch railings. Sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair tied up in a handkerchief. She swept the floors, cleaned out the hearth, planted herbs in a cracked clay pot by the window. Boone repaired the barn door-trimmed fence posts hauled in firewood. Miss Cartwright came by with an old stove that had sat unused behind the schoolhouse. Dr. Morley sent a bundle of dried herbs and a quilt her sister had left behind. The town, once quiet toward Ellie, now watched her with a kind of respectful curiosity. She didn't speak much, but she smiled more, especially when Boone was near. Each evening they sat on the porch as the sky burned itself down into twilight. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't, but always he passed her a cup of hot chicory, and always she drank it slowly, her fingers brushing his when she handed it back. Then, one morning, a letter arrived. Ellie stood beneath the porch eaves envelope, trembling in her hands. Boone stepped down from the ladder, wiping his hands on a rag. "Is it from Kansas?" She nodded and broke the seal. Her eyes scanned the page. "They ruled in my favor," she said quietly. "The children are being escorted by a matron. They'll arrive next week." Boone didn't ask if she was ready. He only said, "We'll ride to meet them." The train arrived beneath a sky bruised with gray. Ellie stood on the platform, hands clenched in her shawl. Boone stood beside her, silent, steady. When the door opened, a woman stepped down, followed by 2 children. Ellie didn't move at first. Willa looked smaller than she remembered, her hair cut shorter, a patch sewn into the hem of her dress. Weston clung to the matron's skirt, wide-eyed and hesitant. Then Willa's gaze lifted. Ellie dropped her gloves. Her knees hit the platform as her arms opened wide. Ma Willa whispered, and then she was running, crashing into Ellie's arms. Weston followed a heartbeat later. Ellie held them both close, her hands trembling in their hair, her voice breaking as she whispered again and again, "I'm here, I'm here, I'm here." The matron nodded once at Boone, who tipped his hat in silent thanks. They rode back in a borrowed wagon. Willa curled against Ellie's side. Weston fell asleep in her lap, hand fisted in her coat. Boone walked beside them most of the way. At the cabin, Boone lifted Weston and carried him inside. Ellie guided Willa by the hand, showing her the stove, the quilt, the little nook by the window where the light was warmest. That night, she tucked them into bed. She kissed their foreheads with a hand that didn't shake. Then she stepped out onto the porch where Boone waited. "I don't know how to name what you've given me," she said. He looked at her soft and steady. "Don't name it. Just live it." She stepped closer. "I want you to stay. I was hoping you'd say that." Her forehead touched his. "I don't just want a roof or land. I want you. I want to wake up with you beside me. I want something that doesn't break when the hard seasons come." Boone's thumb brushed her cheek. "Then that's what we'll build." They didn't kiss right away. They stood there, breath warm between them, wrapped in something deep and real. And when she finally leaned in, it was quiet, sure, and lasting. The first snow came early. Willa stood barefoot on the porch watching the sunrise. Ellie wrapped her arms around the girl's shoulders, resting her chin in her daughter's hair. Inside, Boone stirred the fire with Weston half asleep in his lap. The scent of cedar and something sweet filled the room. Outside, the creek moved beneath a skin of ice. Birds shifted in the trees. Ellie turned to the door, looked once at the land that was now hers, not borrowed, not promised. Hers. Then she stepped inside into the warmth, into the life they had built from almost nothing. Into home. The story of Eleanor Hart is not just a tale of hardship, it is a story of unimaginable strength and quiet triumph. What began with a collapse at a dusty train station in the middle of nowhere became a long, winding road back to life, motherhood, and dignity. Every moment in Ellie's journey from that first trembling breath on Boone's chest to her standing tall before a judge in Topeka speaks to a resilience that many never realize they possess until life demands it. Ellie was once a woman, silenced by cruelty, bruised by betrayal, and forced to flee from everything she held dear. Her journey back was not fast. It was not easy, but it was real. It was carved out by small, brave steps, writing a letter, asking for help, sitting in a chair long enough to feel safe again. It was built from kind silences and slow mornings, from planting herbs in cracked pots and learning to trust hands that didn't strike but steadied. And it was carried forward by love, quiet, unspoken at first, but undeniable. Boone Whitaker never claimed to be a hero. He wasn't a man of grand gestures or polished words. He was a man who simply showed up day after day with a cup of tea, a patch of land, and a heart wide enough to hold Ellie's pain without needing to explain it. His strength was in his presence, in the way he never pushed her to speak, but never let her feel alone. He understood that some healing happens in silence, in space, in shared work. Boone's gift was not in rescuing Ellie, it was in standing beside her until she rescued herself. Together, they rebuilt a life. Not a perfect one, but a real one. The cabin by Ember Creek was never meant to be a symbol, it was meant to be lived in, weathered and warmed. With every board they nailed, every fence they mended, and every corner they cleaned, they laid down something more important than roots. They built safety, stability, love. And when the day came for Ellie to see her children again, when Willa ran into her arms and Weston buried his face in her coat, it wasn't just a reunion. It was the beginning of something that could finally be called home. Her arms didn't shake, her voice didn't falter. She was no longer a woman surviving from one moment to the next. She was a mother, a partner, a keeper of land, of love, of legacy. Their story ends not with a dramatic flourish, but with a quiet morning, the first snow of the season. A girl standing barefoot on a porch, a mother wrapping her arms around the child she thought she'd lost forever. Inside, warmth hummed, a fire crackled. A boy dozed in the lap of the man who had helped rebuild their world. That was the victory. Not the court ruling, not the land deed, but the peace of knowing they were safe. Together. Unbreakable. So what do we learn from Eleanor Hart's journey? We learn that healing doesn't follow a schedule. It's slow, often invisible and full of backsteps. But it's real. We learn that it's never too late to take back what was stolen, to raise your voice, to find your footing. Ellie teaches us that running is not weakness, it's sometimes the first act of courage, and that coming back facing what once broke you is the most powerful choice of all. Boone shows us the power of presence. You don't always need the right words, you just need to stay, to be steady, to believe in someone even when they've forgotten how to believe in themselves. In a world that often demands speed and noise, Boone reminds us of the strength found in quiet, in waiting, in showing up again and again. Together, they show us that love doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes it's in the way someone fixes a roof or brews a cup of chicory. Sometimes it's in shared silence, in the way hands brush when passing a letter, or in the steady gaze of someone who sees who you are, even before you can say it. And perhaps the most powerful lesson of all, home, is not a place you find. It's a place you build. One brick, one kind gesture, one choice at a time. Home is in the stories we tell, the pain we survive, the love we dare to believe we deserve. It's in the people who choose to stay when it's hard. In the land that holds our footsteps. In the porch light we leave on. Ellie and Boone's journey may have started in shadows, but it ends in light because they lit it themselves, through kindness, through patience, through fierce love. And in doing so, they remind us all that no matter how lost we feel, we can begin again. We can come home. If this story touched your heart, inspired you, or simply reminded you of the power we all carry within us, please consider supporting this journey by subscribing to our channel. Your support keeps these stories alive and gives us the strength to keep telling them. Let's ride on together, because every story matters, and sometimes all it takes is one person who doesn't walk away. Thank you for watching. Subscribe now and stay with us for more stories of courage, love, and the wild hearts who helped shape the West. Wild West Stories. Every story is a legend.